Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to another episode of Maritime Matters. We're your hosts, Jen Parker and Richard Dudley. This is the Maritime Matters podcast, where we discuss the key developments and activities affecting maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. We're recording this on Tuesday, the 1st of April, on the afternoon of Tuesday. So whatever happens in the next sort of 24, 48 hours, particularly there's been a lot of chatter about stuff happening around Taiwan. We're not going to talk about it this time because we really don't know what's going on yet, but it might be something we'll pick up on next time. How are you, Jen?
Hey, I'm good, Richard. Lots happening from a maritime perspective in the Indo-Pacific. As you mentioned, we're recording this on the 1st of April, which sometimes...
No April Fools.
Well, it feels a little bit like it with some of the reporting in Australia at the moment. But we do have a Chinese survey vessel, research vessel, that is transiting south of Australia at the moment that has made the press, which we will get into in this show. What is it? What is it doing? AUKUS has been a big discussion in Australia over the last week, and I was lucky enough to be at the I think it was called the Security and Sovereignty Conference, led by our former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, yesterday to speak about AUKUS, and he's just delivered a press club address here in Australia on AUKUS, which I'm certain will get a lot of media attention. But lots of other things happening in Indo-Pacific. You mentioned Taiwan, some stuff happening in the Philippines. So I'm good. Lots happening. What's been happening with you? What have you been working on?
So I've, as I mentioned to you just now, I've had a deadline I've had to meet. I had a history paper article that I had to write. So I've been head down trying to get some words down on the keyboard, talking about the Royal Navy in the First World War and talking about publicity and how and why navies don't like to talk about what they do and what the negative implications are. At some stage, I'll pull it out and try and talk a bit more about the contemporary relevance of it. But I had to get some words down on the paper this week, so that's been my week.
I really look forward to reading that. Of course, quite topical in Australia, where we have the debate about how much defence does or does not engage with the general public, and how limited the general public's understanding of defence can actually be. As I learnt today whilst I was explaining to someone what Maritime Border Command is. So fantastic. Well, that'll be really, really interesting. I actually did a podcast, by the way, in the last week with a colleague of yours. I felt like I was cheating on Maritime Matters, but there is an ANU National Security College podcast out with myself, David Andrews from the National Security College, and Douglas Guilfoyle, Professor Douglas Guilfoyle from UNSW, talking about Chinese naval ships in the vicinity of Australia, which... given the civilian research ship in the vicinity of Australia has become quite topical again. So you can check that out, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes.
I listened to that earlier. It's excellent. So I strongly recommend anyone take a listen to that. You won't get two better people talking about that kind of subject than Jen and Doug. So, and as you say, I think it helps put into context some of the things that are going on right now. So I'd strongly recommend a listen there.
Oh, that's very kind. So I should mention, for our US audience, that I did do a podcast on SimSec, which is a great US maritime podcast talking about a Coast Guard for Australia. But before we spend the rest of the episode cross-promoting other things, what is actually happening in the region, and what are we going to talk about today, Richard?
So the big news story, certainly in the past 24, 48 hours in Australia, has been the Chinese research ship. It's often referred to, in our media at least, as a spy ship. It is and I'm going to butcher this terribly, but it's the Tansu Yihao, which is about a 10,000-ton ice-rated research vessel. It's operated by the Institute of Deep Sea Science and Engineering, which is a branch of the Chinese Academy of Science. It's a big vessel. It operates a range of submersibles and ROVs, all kind of exploration and research purposes, oceanic and sort of seabed research purposes. It has been in our neck of the woods for some time. It's been conducting research with New Zealand's National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, exploring a place called the Pusiga Trench, which I must say I've never heard of. It's somewhere to the south of South Island of Australia, of New Zealand, and it's really deep. And they were going down and trying to work out what was down there. The vessel left Wellington on the 23rd of March, but rather than sailing as one would expect north through the Coral Sea, it has instead transited south of Australia, and is currently somewhere about 400 to 500 nautical miles south of the Australian coast in the Great Australian Bight. This has caused all sorts of excitement in Australian press and national security circles, talking about this spy ship and whether or not it's attacking or monitoring or whatever cables or all sorts of other things that are being discussed. As you can probably tell from my tone, I'm a little on the skeptical side about some of this. That is not to say that this stuff doesn't take place. We know there's been a huge amount of survey work done by the Chinese, particularly in the Indian Ocean and in the region of areas like Indonesia. And there's been a kind of widespread belief that this is aimed at eventually supporting not only civilian purposes, but also supporting PLAN submarine operations. So the Chinese absolutely do this stuff. I just haven't seen any evidence that what is happening here is that. There's no evidence that this ship is engaged in any kind of survey operation, and the kind of the time frames from it leaving Wellington to being where it is would kind of preclude most of that sort of thing. So that's been very much the big story in the Australian media. What's your take? I think you're maybe slightly less cynical than I am.
It's interesting, right? I think that for those that aren't Australian who are listening or watching online, you need to understand that Australia is in an election campaign. So it felt like in Australia we've been in an election campaign all year. There was a view that we'd have an election earlier this year. That didn't happen for a number of reasons. And last week was it Friday morning, the Prime Minister visited our Governor General and called an election. So Australia is going to have an election on the 3rd of May. I think that's important because when we talk about how certain things, whether it be the Euro-Atlantic relationship or what's happening in Ukraine, or Chinese naval task groups, or a Chinese research vessel in the vicinity of Australia, they have to be viewed with that election tinge, right? And I think there is a certain element of people are going to make more of these issues because they want to encourage there to be a debate about defence and defence spending in the election. Which I think for Australia right now, both of our major parties, our Liberal and Labor parties, are very keen for this to be an election about cost of living, and nobody wants it to be an election about defence issues. So I think that you certainly do see some of the commentators and some of the media getting a little bit more excited than perhaps they would because of that. I think that's a slight element. Look, I think that it's good that we're having a national conversation about, the Chinese Naval Task Group, which we've talked about on previous podcasts, and now this research vessel, because I think what we haven't been having a conversation for a long time is how does China operate in the maritime domain, and how might that affect Australia, right? And we know that there's been a lot of tension between kind of China and India about survey vessels and marine research in the Indian Ocean and other places. So I think this is a good conversation. I did say on radio earlier that I don't agree with the nomenclature of spy ship. I think that's a little bit over the top, so I would agree with you on that point. Look, certainly it is a very capable marine research vessel. Obviously, it has been transiting from New Zealand South Island at speed, which means that it has limited any marine research it could potentially have done. That's not to say, though, that it doesn't stop and loiter somewhere and do something, right? And I think we also need to remember, too, in the context of marine scientific research, of course, the information you garner can be dual purpose, right? So it can be just trying to understand what's happening on the sea floor and in the water column. It can also be trying to understand where Australia's not promulgated submarine cables are, or what are appropriate submarine routes, etc., right? So it can be both, although we've seen no evidence of both. But I think we also need to highlight the fact that actually, when you think about the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, it kind of envisaged that marine scientific research was something that everybody did for the greater good, right? So there's actually not a lot of restrictions on it, even within the exclusive economic zone. And this has become a tension between China and in fact Indonesia at some points, where even in the exclusive economic zone, there is this view that yes, you do have to get approval. So in accordance with the section of UNCLOS on marine scientific research, you need to request approval before you do marine scientific research in someone's exclusive economic zone. And you need to do that 6 months in advance. But there's also this view within UNCLOS that it should be approved, right? Like there's only very few reasons within UNCLOS that you can decline that marine scientific research. So I think it's an interesting conversation. I'm not suggesting it is doing marine scientific research, but I think, look, it's an over-egged conversation in Australia. It's not a spy ship, but I think it's a good conversation for Australia to be having, because if it highlights to Australia how vulnerable we are in terms of our submarine cables and our sea lines of communication, then fantastic. That's kind of my initial takes.
Fair enough. I do worry what the response will be as and when the Chinese decide to survey the waters off Western Australia, for example. But yes, I think that certainly it is a conversation we need to have, and I think that was exactly the kind of where we ended up landing, talking about the task force, right? That if this actually does start generating a good conversation, then that's a positive that can come out of it. Moving on, because we can't talk all day about the
what?
the spy
I feel like
ship.
I have been talking about it. That and AUKUS, I have been talking about it all day.
What's been going on in terms of China's new bits of kit that everyone's been talking about with regard to Taiwan?
Everybody has been talking about China's new Amphibious. Some people are calling them barges. Alex Luck in Naval News makes a good point that at least a number of the designs are self-propelled, so they're not technically barges. Alex, you're a geek. But everybody has been talking about it, and we did have a comment on our YouTube to ask us to talk about it. So quickly, Will, I think if you want more detail on this, obviously go to Tom Shugart from CNAS. He also writes a bit for Naval News, and Alex Luck actually has a really good Naval News article about it that kind of breaks it down, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. I guess the key point is in about January this year, there was some satellite imagery that came out, and I think it was Tom Shugart that was the first to kind of point out that they looked like China was building something different, right? Some sort of what you will call a jack-up barge, which is effectively a vessel that has legs, really, right? So has legs, deploys those legs to be able to stabilize itself to get heavy capabilities ashore. And so this is seen a lot in kind of the offshore oil industry and other resource exploitation, this kind of, effectively that's what some oil rigs are, right, really? And so it's kind of designed to be this vessel that can stabilize itself by deploying its legs, fix itself in position, and pass heavy equipment via a bridge ashore. There's kind of 4 types of vessels that seem to have been have been made. 1 looks like a prototype, 3 looks like they're actual vessels, and they kind of differ certainly in terms of length and beam width, and also the amount of legs they have, whether it be 4, 6, or 8. And of course, that kind of impacts what they can transit, where they can position. 2 of the prototypes look to have the ability to have vessels come alongside them to transfer equipment. And I guess the question is, what are these barges for? And so there's been a lot of discussion that this is an indication of China preparing for an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. And there's always been this view that if China was preparing their military for an invasion of Taiwan, you would get some sort of indication in terms of the capabilities they're building and how they're posturing their forces, and you'd be able to pick that up by a satellite. So some commentators have said this is an indication of preparations. It may be, it may not be. I think it is clearly a capability that has been designed with the invasion of Taiwan in mind. I mean, there's been some people arguing online that this is a humanitarian disaster relief, but this kind of jack-up barge with a bridge going onto the beach is not designed for humanitarian and disaster relief in any way, shape, or form. There are different ways to do that, especially if you're doing it in a permissive environment. So it certainly is around amphibious operations, not the first wave of amphibious operations, because actually getting these into position and sending them up would take a whole lot of effort to defend them. So really there's an expectation that the first wave is done by, LPDs or LSTs, and you have some degree of control over that beachhead before you're going to put these in position. But look, I think they're really interesting. I don't think that they are a preparation for an invasion right now, but I think it's certainly another indication that this is a mission that China is definitely preparing its military forces for. And you only need to listen to what Xi Jinping says about it, where he doesn't rule off a military invasion to go, yeah, okay, well, that's a prudent operational planning on that point. Now, I've probably done the details, i.e. the length and the beam width and where the legs are and where the bridges are, a little bit of injustice. And there is a lot of information about that online, and certainly you can find that in Alex's Naval News piece, which we'll share a point to. But that's kind of a brief summary. What is your take on naval barge gate? And also, can you, since you are a historian, I'm going to put you on the spot. We can edit it out if you stuff it up. But can you also talk about the mulberry bridges that this is being compared to, which it is actually very, very different. But I'll get you to talk about that.
Absolutely. So this is, I think it's a really interesting kind of capability. And as you say, the argument about this all being about humanitarian aid did make me chuckle. This is clearly not about that. I guess the first point to make is that the first target of any kind of amphibious operation is always to seize a deep water port. Because the big challenge of any amphibious operation is that you need to be able to resupply forces over the beach faster than the enemy can resupply forces over land. And that's really hard. So anything you can do that makes that resupply of your kit onto land easier is important, and anything you can do that enables you to actually push out the time frame in which you need to seize a deep water port in order to sustain your operations is really important. And that's precisely where the Mulberry Harbour idea kind of comes from. These are, I guess, the best way you can view them is part of them were actually, it was more like a breakwater, and they were both specifically designed units, but also some of them were old ships that were sunk in almost more like a pier, and then there was a harbour element to it. So it was a bit like a breakwater. But again, this is this idea of when the Allies land on D-Day, you can start doing your stuff, which looks a bit like Saving Private Ryan, of getting stuff off onto the beach, driving onto the beach itself. But that's not a very good way to get large amounts of kit onto land. You need to be able to use much bigger ships and have a much wider pool of tonnage to be able to do so. So that's where the Mulberry Harbours come from, and that's similar with this type of capability. It would allow you to use civilian vessels which are not designed to basically go up onto a beach and offload direct. And it would allow you to use those to get material from, in this case, the Chinese mainland onto Taiwan. So it's a really important kind of stepping stone capability if it does what everyone is suggesting that it could do. So I think it's certainly an important development. Does it mean that there's going to be an invasion in 2027? Absolutely not. But should we be taking Xi Jinping at his word when he says that this is something that he's looking very seriously at doing? Then I think, yes, we should. And this is simply a sign that the PLA is doing what they're told and preparing in some ways or other to be able to at least give the Chinese government that option.
I agree. I think great work in terms of the picking up of this
Oh,
capability in January by satellite imagery. Another thing worth a quick mention, just back to the Royal Australian Navy in Australia for a moment. HMAS Sydney, one of Australia's 3 Hobart-class destroyers, has deployed on a regional presence deployment, which is just a way of saying they've gone up top. Something Australia's been doing for a very, very long time, but they're now called regional presence deployment. So Sydney's going to be operating certainly in Southeast Asia. I would assume Northeast Asia as well, but the release says that Sydney will be operating there for about 3 months, and they'll be doing Exercise Basama Shield. Exercise Basama Shield being one of the Basama exercises under the Five Power Defence Agreement, which is the agreement between Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, New Zealand, and the UK. So it's a kind of a standard exercise. And it comes on the back of Hobart, HMAS Hobart, which is one of our other air warfare destroyers returning from this deployment in kind of mid-February.
As you say, I think it's part of a regular cycle of things that have been sort of going on for a long time, and used to be described as going up top, but hasn't been called that for quite some time. But I think it's definitely a sign of. I think a lot of the comms around this is a sign not merely of the fact that there are so few ships. I like your cynicism, but I think there's also a willingness or a keenness to be a bit more clear with the messaging around this. And I suspect we will see things like Sydney involved in some of what we're going to be talking about in just a second, multilateral maritime cooperative activities. Again, a lot of this is about signalling and about sort of showing Australia's commitment and presence in the region. So in that regard, I think it's a good thing. Comms.
I agree. I actually do think this is something Australia has done quite well in terms of, naval diplomacy has been a key tool of governments for a very, very long time. But one of the criticisms of many naval diplomacy efforts across many countries has been it's not necessarily aligned with the country's foreign policy or diplomats. And I think that Australia kind of, since the inception of, Indo-Pacific Endeavour, which is our major, well, normally a task group deployment, wasn't last year, but we won't get into that, around the region, which commenced in, God, I should remember because I was on the first one, 2017, has really been about trying to sync up Australia's naval diplomacy with its broader defence diplomacy and foreign policy. And so I think the signalling you see around the regional presence deployments is a key effort of that. I wasn't trying to be cynical. I think this is great. I think Australian presence in the region is fantastic. I think the way we coordinate is fantastic. I am cynical about the amount of ships that the Royal Australian Navy currently has, and that's just a fact. That's just a fact.
Anyway, I've mentioned
on.
already MMCAs. There's been another MMCA, and I'm going to keep using the phrase because I know it annoys you.
I hate it.
Conducted near Scarborough Shoal. So this is in the South China Sea on Friday. So that's a few days ago. This was by the US, Japan, and the Philippines. So an American Arleigh Burke DDG, one of the Philippines frigates, and a Japanese Mogami. I think it might have been the Mogami that was down our neck of the woods, but I would have to confirm that. But they conducted a patrol within the Philippine EEZ as part of this multilateral maritime cooperative activity. As is seemingly now de rigueur, they were shadowed by a Chinese frigate in the process, which, by some reporting, apparently got quite close. So I think this is now sort of part of a set pattern that we will continue to see relatively regularly as long as these three nations and, to a degree, Australia as well, continue to conduct these activities. Also announced this week in a kind of related news that Japan will be officially joining Exercise Bala-Katan, which should be kicking off in the next few weeks as a full member this year. So exercise Bala-Katan has long been a kind of a bilateral exercise between the Philippines and the US. And recently it's been kind of very focused on, obviously, the South China Sea, but also on quite a lot of the, I guess, that littoral and maritime area. So last year we saw the deployment of the Typhoon missile system, which is designed to fire missiles and target ships at sea. And you're seeing quite a lot of focus on this and linking up with the US Marines and their new kind of concepts, expeditionary advanced base operations, and that sort of. So in some ways, it's very similar to quite a lot of the way in which the Australian Defence Force has been shifting post DSR. But exercise Bala-Katan has become something of a hub of that sort of thing, and it's interesting that the Japanese they've long had some kind of presence there, but they're kind of getting fully fledged membership as of this.
Talking about exercise Bala-Katan is the US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, in the Philippines. And I think this is really important because there has been a lot of conversation, certainly in Australia, I suspect in many other places, including Canada and Europe, and I would suspect Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines as well, of what does the new US administration mean for alliances, right? And I think a lot of the thing that has obviously sparked that has been the breakdown of, or what appears to be a breakdown of relationship across the Euro-Atlantic, certainly what appears to be a breakdown of relationship between the US and Canada, et cetera, right? So there's a big question in the Indo-Pacific of what does this mean for Indo-Pacific alliances? Does it mean anything? Does it mean a lot? And so I think it was really good to see the US Secretary of Defense in the region, visiting the Philippines. He also went to Japan and a couple of other places, but he made some fairly strong statements in the Philippines when it comes to the alliance. So he said, the United States has been fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Philippines since World War II. Our partnership not only continues today, but we are doubling down on that partnership, and our ironclad alliance has never been stronger. And I think that's really important wording because it is contrast quite significantly with how he described the US relationship with Europe and NATO at the Ukraine contact group in about February this year, which kind of got the whole discussion around alliances going. So I think that's been pretty strong. In that visit, US Secretary of Defense Hegseth outlined what he called a four-piece plan for the relationship between the US and Philippines, which Hegseth said would build upon the US commitment in 2024, where they have already committed to $500 million to modernize the Philippine military. This four-piece plan includes an agreement that the US will deploy additional military capabilities to the Philippines, and one of the key ones to come out of that is Nemesis, which I'll get into a little bit. It also plans for more bilateral training between both nations for high-end operations, which is a shift that we have seen in the last 12 months in terms of the nature of the exercises and even the growth of exercise Bala-Katan that you mentioned before in terms of the complexity and the kinds of things that it is dealing with. It also includes an agreement to prioritize bilateral defense, industrial cooperation, which I think is interesting. Not clear what that might mean, and also some stuff on bilateral cyber stuff. So I think, in the context of what has been said about Indo-Pacific alliances, I think this is a really positive statement. And so on Nemesis, so Nemesis being the Navy Marine Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, that's going to be deploying to the Philippines for exercise Bala-Katan, so reinforcing that Typhoon deployment in 2024, which got a fair bit of response from China, and I'm pretty sure that Typhoon is still in the Philippines. Is my understanding. So it is a deployment, but it has now been there for a long time, and so this is kind of that moving of land-based maritime strike capability into the region. Into the Philippines for exercise Bala-Katan under the guise of an exercise, but certainly kind of changing the US posture and footprint in the region, which I think is fairly significant in itself. This is pretty interesting to Australia as well, though. Australia having just agreed, I'm not sure when we exactly agreed it, but in the last 12 months or so, well, in fact, actually, I think it was 2022, but to acquire the Naval Strike Missile and the Joint Strike Missile. We've now integrated the Naval Strike Missile into our ships. Richard, what's your take on Hegseth's visit to the Philippines and also Nemesis?
Yeah, so with both the visit to the Philippines and his speech a little bit before then, he was in Hawaii visiting Indo-Pacific just before that. I must say, I am one of those who is perhaps half glass empty on elements of this, and I know we've kind of had a back and forth about this. I am more cynical or skeptical about the American alliance, and the Trump administration and its impact on that. But the language Hegseth's using is very positive, right? It's everything that the allies in the region would have wanted to hear. Talking about kind of building up deterrence, or in his words, restoring deterrence. I wasn't entirely sure it had ever gone anywhere, but that's the politics of this, right? But sort of really pushing alliances. There was discussion around the idea of this being America first, but America first doesn't mean America only, and how America is still heavily reliant on its alliances and building up posture in the Indo-Pacific. So all of this kind of language is exactly what people in Canberra and Manila and Seoul and in Tokyo will be wanting to hear. So in that respect, I think it's good. Let's wait and see whether or not the sort of the action follows through with this. But in that regard, I think it's positive. In terms of the sort of American developments and the discussion around sort of Nemesis and forces in for Bala-Katan, I think it's really interesting from an Australian perspective, particularly, as I say, from an Australian Army perspective. There's been a lot of discussion within the Australian Army about kind of littoral manoeuvre and the ability of the Australian Army being kind of reformed in order to be able to contribute to what is primarily a maritime theatre or a maritime land sort of littoral theatre. So there's obviously been some progress with that, but one of the things that's being looked at currently is the development, I think, of what's often known as the Strike Master, which is a kind of a bushmaster with a naval strike missiles on it. So that is in some ways quite similar to what the Nemesis is. And I think that you can see some sort of considerable parallels between the ideas and the operations that the Americans are looking at and exploring with the Philippines as part of Bala-Katan and elsewhere, and some of the stuff that the Australian Army is doing. So I think there's some really interesting parallels there, and I suspect that there will be a reasonably significant Australian presence at Bala-Katan and sort of going forward.
Yeah, definitely. Completely agree. And I think actually, so when you look at the Australian Army contributions to the National Defence Strategy, and thank you very much, Tom McDermott, for giving me a copy of this, he very much talks about how Army views its role kind of in the mysterious archipelago, but in littoral operations, right? So I agree. Other exercises that have been going on, and we are going well over time, as we always do. ASWEX has been going on in Western Australia. Now, having just Googled ASWEX 2025, I would recommend that you don't Google it, because what you do not find is a naval exercise. You find some sort of conference that is not appropriate to talk about on this podcast. So don't Google ASWEX 2025. But there is a major ASW exercise that is occurring. Off the west coast of Australia at the moment. It looks like 1,300 personnel, very much focused on anti-submarine warfare. It's meant to be the largest ASWEX that's ever happened. I don't know. I mean, we always say everything's always the largest, right? I'm not sure. It looks like certainly Australia and New Zealand participating. There's PH, MH60 Romeos, a couple of ships in Australian submarine. And I think that, it's said to be the largest ASWEX ever, or ASW exercise. But no, good to see ASW getting a focus down here. Too often we focus on air warfare as being our kind of priority domain that we need to operate in. So yeah, that's happening. Anything else on ASWEX?
No, I'm not. As you say, I think it's really important, and even it's happening in Western Australia to a degree, obvious reasons, but also the ability to conduct ASW operations in the Indian Ocean is something that is going to be potentially of significant relevance to Australia once again. The development of naval assets in Western Australia came at least in part because the Soviets started deploying submarines there, and the the wheel turns once again, and I think we will going to see more and more Chinese submarines. Certainly, the Indians think so, and so ASW in the Indian Ocean is going to become a bigger theme, I suspect. Moving on. Oh, go
And
for it.
before we move on, though, just to get a point that I always kind of like jabbing in there, which is when the discussion in the Australian debate about naval capability, right, is always focused on how many missiles you can get to sea, right? And I just think that, yes, that is clearly important, but also we need to think about our ability to operate across other spheres of warfare, which is why getting a future ASW ship, although I never agreed with 9, with a low-frequency active totalized sonar like 2087 is going to be incredibly important for operations in the Indian Ocean. So anyway, just to give ASW a plug, and not just because I was an anti-submarine warfare officer. But anyway, moving on, we should talk about capability. It's going to be one big capability announcement. What's happened with that?
So I guess the one that flags up from our perspective, from an Australian perspective, was the test firing of LRASM, the long range anti ship missile. We have to have nice snazzy acronyms for everything, right? So everyone talks about LRASMs, which was it was conducted, and we don't know quite when, but the announcement was made about a week or so ago. That LRASM is now available for operational use after a test that was conducted by the RAAF from an FA-18 Hornet, Super Hornet, off the coast of California last month. It was a test that was, as with so much of this, supported by the United States, but involved quite a lot of RAAF assets, including a wedge tail and a growler, as well as the FA-18 Super Hornet. So it's a real significant uptick in kind of maritime strike capability. By all accounts, LRASM is a very potent weapon, and it extends out the range, the strike range, to somewhere around 370 kilometers, at least in the open domain. Now, quite how many of these we have acquired, I think, is unclear. That the government or the Defence Press statement said a total of just under 900 million has been allocated for the acquisitions. I don't know how many LRASMs that buys, but as always, I think that's going to be more of a limiting factor than the capability of the weapon, which is to say, by all accounts, a very, very capable missile and a significant addition to the wider Australian maritime strike capability.
It is. And while we're talking about Air Force, by the way, we should actually acknowledge, since we're talking about maritime matters, not just naval matters, there was a 104th birthday of the Royal Australian Air Force yesterday on the 31st of March. So happy birthday if anyone is listening from the Royal Australian Air Force. We do talk about not just naval ships. Look, that's pretty much all we had for capability today. There have been some other developments. There's some reporting about Taiwanese USVs, uncrewed surface vessels, etc. But we do need to wrap this up because we do go for too long and we are ill-disciplined. We were asked to comment on GoShark, GoShark being the extra large autonomous underwater vehicle that Australia is, or the Royal Australian Navy is developing in conjunction with Anduril. Look, there really haven't been too many updates on GoShark in 2025. The contract was signed between the Royal Australian Navy and Anduril in, I think it was 2022. We saw the first design kind of unveiled as quite a large looking, interesting looking, a bit boxy looking submarine in April 2024. But really, as far as I'm tracking, there haven't been a lot more kind of developments on it from that since that. We certainly haven't had anything revealed in terms of what kind of capabilities it might be carrying, what kind of mission packages it might carry. You can only assume mining is probably a good focus for it. But look, I think it's a great capability that the Australian Navy is investigating and working with. But there's no real updates. Richard, any comments on GoShark?
No, I think as you say, it's an interesting technology that's being developed. I think there are still some very big questions around the kind of operational concepts and how it fits into the wider picture. We always have to remember that new technologies don't just kind of come out of the box and wonderfully revolutionize everything. They have to be fit into wider systems, and I don't think we really yet know whether it's Ghost Shark or whether it's Orca or any one of the other of these extra large uncrewed underwater vehicles. We don't really quite know what they're going to do yet, and there are some sort of significant other challenges. But it's certainly something that navies should be developing, and it's good that the RAN is kind of on the cutting edge. My one kind of word of pushback is against the kind of the claims occasionally that, oh well, we can bin AUKUS, look, we've got Ghost Shark. They are very different beasts. So let's kind of remember that for now, at least, crewed submarines continue to serve a very important purpose. Ghost Shark is a useful, potentially very useful, but kind of exploratory technology would be how I would best describe it now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned that contract signed in 2022. That contract was only signed for I guess, 3 prototypes to be delivered by mid-2025. So, I mean, we should see some more information about that soon, but it wasn't yet large-scale production. And it's not the only UUV, uncrewed underwater vehicle, that Australia is exploring. We should also mention the Speartooth from C2 Robotics and a few other things. But certainly not replacing AUKUS. I did actually have that question in a conference yesterday, which hopefully I suitably fracked down. Well, Rich, I think that's all we've got time for.
Very full episode this time.
It is a very full episode. There is lots to discuss. There's obviously lots that we didn't discuss. That's because you cannot talk about everything in what's meant to be a 35-minute episode, which is already a 45-minute episode. So look, thanks so much, Richard, and see you next time on Maritime Matters.
Good to chat.